I would like to introduce our first speaker today, Professor Luke O'Neill, Chair of Biochemistry in Trinity College, Dublin. Luke is a renowned author and commentator on COVID-19. He did his undergraduate degree at Trinity College and his PhD at the Royal College of Surgeons in England, where his specialisation was pharmacology. He returned to Trinity to take up his post 8 years ago, and today he will share the most current information on the pandemic, vaccinations and lessons learned.
Lovely, thanks very much, Hazel. I'll just share my screen in the grand tradition of screen sharing. And I'm very happy to talk to you this morning. Shame we can't be together in person, I suppose, but that's not far off either, by the way. And it's a great moment to reflect, actually. And first of all credit to the INMO telephone triage people. You've done a great job, I imagine, over the past year and a half now, which has been the most striking sort of part of our history in many ways in terms of what's been happening, as you all know. So well done. We all deserve a pat on the back in many ways, actually, because our country has come through this. And there are real grounds for optimism today, and there have been for the past 2 to 3 months, really. So I think we've reached a real point, to be honest, in the pandemic, and we can begin to really think we're going to get out of this soon. Of course, there's unknowns, and there's still a couple of serious things happening, which I'll cover. But overall, it's an incredible thing in the last sort of 3 to 6 months, mainly because of vaccinations, as you all know. This morning, I walked up from the Dart up to News Talk for my regular Monday morning slot at 9 a.m. The streets were packed. I couldn't believe it. I mean, all of you back at their offices. There was a real sense that today is yet another step in the right direction. I gave my stuff with Anton Savage was in place of Pat Kenny this morning, and I gave my latest update. I've been on News Talk twice a week for the past year and a half. I'm now going to go to once a week. There's a good sign as well, because that means there's less COVID stuff to talk about, which is great. I'm going to go back to what I used to do, which is mainly other science stories, because obviously when COVID began, we switched mainly into COVID. And they asked me to talk about COVID a lot because, first of all, I'm an immunologist. That's my area. And then secondly, my lab began to work on COVID. We had 4 separate projects running on COVID, 3 of which are still running. So my whole research then began to sort of focus more and more on COVID. And I was very happy to give out the information as much as I could. And we were privileged, me and my colleagues, to be asked into the media a lot to keep the public informed. Great colleagues like Kingston Mills, you've heard of, I mean, it's amazing how many people know us now. Clean O'Farrelly, Clean Callig, you know, they all stepped up and we all did to give the information out. But the good news is we're coming out of it. You'll see less of us. That's got to be a good thing because this will now become an epidemic in the end, as I'll explain, when the fear begins to go away. And I thought I'd cover 2 things, learning from COVID and where we've got to, and then what the future might actually look like as my 2 main topics. Now, it goes without saying, the action is all to do with the vaccines. And again, when I think back on it myself, one of the big moments for me, without doubt, was last November, when Pfizer announced their top-line data from their 40,000 patient trial with our RNA vaccine, and they reported 92% efficacy in that trial. We just were absolutely blown away by this. Now, we knew there would be vaccines. The mystery we had was, when will they arrive? Of course, they had to be shown to be safe, very important, as you all know, safety first, and efficacious, and they weren't guaranteed. I mean, there were risks in this process, but the great phrase we were using was cautiously optimistic, as you may remember. So when that result came out last November, we all began to breathe a bit easier. And then a week later, Moderna's vaccine trial was reported with 95% efficacy. I mean, that's fantastic. That really reassured me. There were 2 separate vaccines now. In other words, Pfizer wasn't a one-off. This was now a beatable disease because of those 2 vaccines. And look what's happened since. I mean, I made this slide a couple of weeks ago. So back in June 2015, there were no vaccines. Oh, sorry, June 15, 2020, there were no vaccines. A year later, look at this, June 8th, 8 vaccines approved. Amazingly, 4 approved in Ireland and in Europe. So what a great achievement. And by the way, many vaccines coming up behind. Look at this. This is all the different phases of the clinical trials. We will have more vaccines for COVID. What's also important is the technology that's been found for COVID is now being used for malaria, TB, HIV, 3 of the big infectious diseases that still kill millions and millions a year, mainly in developing world countries. They're now going to try this technology to try to make vaccines for those. We've tried to get vaccines for AIDS for a long time and failed. This new technology might be useful now for other infectious diseases where we need a vaccine. And that's a great example, actually, of a spin-off. So in other words, we're going to beat COVID. We're close to beating it. And there's a bold statement in spite of some of the unknowns. Let's now use what we've learned from COVID for other situations. And that will be other infectious diseases. It'll also be, by the way, other inflammatory diseases of the airways. Back to that in a minute. My own lab mainly works on therapeutics, actually, for inflammatory situations. COVID is another inflammatory disease. We may well get medicines that work more effectively for, say, COPD or severe asthma from this research, by the way, because if we can repress inflammation in the lungs in one context, that might be used in another. So we're going to see, I think, a lot of good things will come out of this research beyond COVID into the future. Now, once the vaccines were there and we began to see the data, the mission then became to try to encourage people to take them. And that was not a trivial task. And with many people, myself and Kingston and so on, advising this and saying, look, here's the data, you decide. The data was so compelling in terms of safety, efficacy, many bumps along the road, as you would. I'm sure you guys were getting lots of contact with people over these issues about things like clots, and all kinds of worries and concerns were happening all the time. I was getting at one point back in February, March, 50 emails a day from people with worries and concerns. And you guys, people here on the meeting, were on the front line for this, I imagine, as well. So, and again, I try and answer as best I could. I'm sure you guys did as well. I'd give the data, I'd refer them to websites and just say, look, these are really fantastic vaccines. There is, of course, a risk with them, as with anything. And there were risks of certain things. And the allergy response was one, you may remember, the clotting with the AstraZeneca vaccine. These didn't become an issue because they checked it very carefully for safety. And I began to, advocate strongly, and we all did, based on data. And remember, my only mission was to give out the science, that's it, and let people decide for themselves. And what a great response that our country has had. We are #1 in the EU. This came out on Friday. Here's all the member states. There's Ireland. We're the highest. This is a histogram. We're #1. Over 90% of our adult population has now been fully vaccinated. What a great thing to say that people responded. I think they responded because Irish people are decent overall. They want to do the right thing. And they knew it was the right thing to do. That was the first thing. And then secondly, the information all of us gave out. Brian McCrath deserves huge credit. You probably heard of him. He headed up the whole vaccine campaign. Clear information, honest information. Don't hold back and say, look, there are issues with that clotting. Let's see what we'll do about it, And then people responded. And I think it's a great testament really to our people that they did step up and respond in this way, because it was clear that these vaccines were great, they were safe, and they were the way out of this, and we all wanted to get out of it. And I'd also say this, that people took the vaccine not for themselves often. It was to protect others in the community. And even though you will see breakthrough infections in vaccinated people, they're still decreasing transmission by about 50%. So therefore, as we vaccinate more and more people, the virus begins to go away, and we protect the vulnerable who can't be vaccinated for whatever reason, or certain people who are at risk of vaccines not working, and they be immunosuppressed people, for example. So I think it was partly to do with protecting ourselves and getting our lives back, but also protecting others was why the uptake was so high in Ireland. And I think we can be very proud of it. Now, the next question becomes vaccine sharing, because remember, the only real way out of this pandemic will be to vaccinate the world. And it's very unfair at the moment. 33% of the world's population is fully vaccinated. But there's an amazing fact. This is a brand new disease still, remember, only described, 20 odd months ago now. And yet we've managed to vaccinate a third of the world's population against this new disease. But the trouble is that the red areas need vaccines desperately. Huge inequality. The worry we have now is it'll become like malaria or TB. It'll be a developing world disease with people catching it and suffering, So the only way to deal with this now is to get the vaccine into these countries. And Ireland's about to donate loads of vaccine supply, by the way. And many countries are. So we must do this for ethical reasons. The second reason, as you would all know as well, is the risk of variants cropping up. And there are variants emerging. Initially, we thought this wouldn't be a big problem, strangely, because this virus doesn't mutate that quickly. It's a 10th the mutation rate of HIV/AIDS, for example. It's about a quarter the mutation rate of flu. And as you know, every season, a new flu strain crops up. So we didn't know about this really. The reason the variants crop up is it's so widespread. And a variant happens because every time the virus divides, it makes a mistake. And in the RNA molecule, then you get a slight difference. Now that's a random process, but maybe some of those differences do change the virus. And maybe they make it more transmissible, or maybe they make it more likely to dodge antibodies in the immune system. And that's actually what's happened. And Delta is now the dominant one. It's twice as transmissible as the original strain. And that's a concern. It spreads rapidly as a result. And then the big thing to think about is kind of break through the vaccine. The great news here is, and again, this is relief. My first moment of relief was in last November when Pfizer reported their vaccine. My second moment of relief was, it's about maybe 8 months ago now in Qatar. They reported that the vaccinated population were still being protected against variants in terms of hospitalization. Now, what's happening is you can get infected if you're vaccinated with Delta, because it's just so transmissible, it breaks through a little bit. But the great news is the vaccine is stopping that progressing into your lungs and causing severe disease. And it's over 90% protection against hospitalization and death against Delta. So in other words, you're taking a vaccine against the old-fashioned one, if you like. The immune response is slightly dampened because the new virus has changed and can dodge recognition by antibodies. But the thing is, you make so many antibodies and so many T cells, you swamp it still and stop it progressing. But still, it's still one to watch. We're still watching these variants very carefully. And the reason for this enduring immunity, by the way, is this cell type. This is a memory B cell. This cell was taken from the bone marrow of someone who'd been vaccinated. And these are memory B cells. They pump out antibodies when you're re-challenged with the virus. And even though the virus has changed, there's still sufficient levels of these to make enough antibody to swamp it. The analogy I use here, the quality of the antibody goes down, but quantity will trump quality. You make so much of it, you still are able to neutralize the virus. And everything says this is the case, which we're all relieved by. I mean, there was a risk it would break through completely, and that hasn't happened. We think Delta may be the ultimate. It could be the most fit version now. So therefore, we think, there's optimism that it's going to get as bad as it's going to get, but still we don't know. There could still be other variants that we're concerned about. Now, the current question you will be getting, I bet you, is about boosters, and that's our next thing. And this is very live at the moment, and it's being debated, and lots of data is coming out to address this question. Will people need a third shot? Is what the question is, very simply put. The Lancet last week said current evidence does not therefore appear to show a need for boosting in the general population. Now that's an important phrase, general population, in which efficacy against the virus remains high. So it's good. So most people shouldn't need a booster. That's the first thing. Because the vaccines are so good, you'll still see enduring protection. But the problem is, Public Health England last week released a load of data. They said vaccines are still highly protective against risk of death. That's great. But look at this. Evidence of less protection against severe disease, hospitalization in clinically vulnerable people with both Pfizer and AstraZeneca, and evidence of less protection against severe disease in people over 65, especially with AstraZeneca. That's what the Public Health England conclusions are. Now, what that means is there's about a 20% waning happening. AstraZeneca is especially the one to watch for, especially in the older cohort and the ones who've got certain underlying conditions. They're the ones who will need a booster. And of course, now we're embarking on our booster campaign. What will boosters do? Well, again, we don't fully know. There's still unknowns here. There's still a chance they won't be essential, but governments are erring on the side of caution. I think 27 governments now have announced the booster campaign. Israel have got there first, and they're giving us data. 3 million now have been given a booster, a third shot. They got a huge immune response with the booster, 10 times the antibody level compared to the second shot. So we know they really do kick things off hugely, and they were hugely protective against severe disease, hospitalization, and death in that Israeli situation. So we know from that data anyway, the boosters will have a big protective effect in these people at risk. Now remember, the drop-in efficacy is not huge, but still we'll err on the side of caution. The UK have announced a booster campaign for all the over 50s. Everybody over 50 will be given a booster, and that'll be done by January. Here's the different age cohorts, beginning with the over 80s, and then we get to January and they're all done. Now, this seems to make sense. The main reason for this is they've mainly got AstraZeneca, remember, the UK population. That was their main vaccine. So they've seen the data and they say, right, let's give them a booster with the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines. The RNA vaccines are being used in the booster shots. In Ireland, we're absolutely embarking on our campaign. Residents aged 65 and older in long-term care homes, over 80s, we've said we're doing those. And then the vulnerable, the ones who would have been on immunosuppressants and the vaccine mightn't have worked as well. I'm saying, and many of us, let's go for the over 60s because they mainly had AstraZeneca, as you will remember. So it makes sense now to give all the over 60s a booster. And that may endure for years, remember. The way the immune system works, actually, and we've known this for decades, some vaccines are 3-shot vaccines. Hepatitis B is 3 shots. That third shot causes a massive response that can last for years. So, and I would predict it to be similar with COVID. So once we give the booster to the over 60s, they don't need to come back, right? Now, another variant might crop up and then it'd be like the flu. And you may give vulnerable groups like the flu vaccine, maybe in the same shot. Moderna are making a flu COVID combo at the moment, actually. So that might be part of the future. But there won't be any need to vaccinate everybody again. because the first shots would have worked quite well. We think that there's no need for a booster in the people who are younger and less vulnerable, because we should get an enduring response anyway. And again, we don't know. It's still a work in progress. But for definite, things are holding up. We're not seeing we'd be seeing a big increase in hospitalizations because of Delta if the vaccines weren't still protecting our population, remember. So things are looking good in that regard, but it would make sense to err on the side of caution and give the ones at risk a booster shot. And then ultimately then, they're developing what's called the DREAM vaccine. Now remember, if I dare mention it, there is a risk of more pandemics in the future. And there's a chance of other coronaviruses jumping into humans that are different. Like we got a SARS-CoV-3, So we got to get ready for that. And that's happening. They're making a universal vaccine that should work against any coronavirus. So many in the US especially are already aware of the risk of another pandemic, and let's prepare for it. And let's get ready. Just if it does happen again, we can put the fire out much more quickly is the idea. And I'd be confident of that into the future. And this is a good slide for any people you've all done immunology, I imagine, at some point in your training. Look, this is a great greeting card. May your reactogenicity be minimal, your neutralizing antibody titer is high, and your T and B cells differentiate into memory cells with excellent affinity maturation. That's the wish that we have for all vaccines. If you get that, then you know they're working really well. And that is the case, remember, in most people. So that's great. And the boosters will increase all of that as well. Now, lastly, then my own area, just briefly. So I work on inflammatory diseases, and I've spent over 30 years working on things like rheumatoid arthritis. I've worked on Crohn's disease. Now, what happens in these diseases, again, as you would all well know, is you get a massive inflammatory response in the joint in arthritis, or in the colon, or in the brain in MS, for instance. And I've worked on the nuts and bolts of that process for a long time, trying to develop novel anti-inflammatories. And guess what? COVID is an inflammatory disease. And anybody who works on inflammation would have worked on infectious diseases. Sepsis is the one you would all be aware of, say. I'd done some work on smallpox, amazingly, which there's a vaccine, and that we found very interesting. So in other words, we worked a bit on infectious diseases as well as, say, autoimmune disease. And in fact, COVID, it became very clear it was an inflammatory condition of the lungs. There's macrophages, my main cell type that I work on. There were cytokines being made. It was all, very similar to other inflammatory situations in the airways. And of course, what that meant was then we could develop anti-inflammatories against it. And that began happening. And again, I would guess you all know this, that dexamethasone emerges as an anti-inflammatory. And that was shown in a massive trial, about 14, 15 months ago now that was reported. That's saving 20% of people in hospital. Baricitinib is a very specific anti-inflammatory used for arthritis. Gets repurposed into COVID. It's got a JAK1 inhibitor. JAKs are very interesting as a family of inflammatory proteins that drive signaling pathways that drive inflammation. That's useful. There was a big trial that. Tocilizumab is that targets the cytokine IL-6. Again, that was used in rheumatoid. That's shown benefits. Antibodies, monoclonals, the Regeneron cocktail, Lilly cocktail, they're really effective. They're showing a 70% decrease in hospitalization from COVID, amazing, in the trials. They're being widely used in the US. They're being used in Ireland, I believe, to some extent. Then there's the antiviral remdesivir. That works a bit if it's given early, doesn't really work if it's too late. And then interferon beta is a cytokine that's antiviral. That seems to show benefits. So what I'm saying is, all these therapies are there now. So what this means in a nutshell is, COVID-19 is now a preventable disease through vaccination. And if you do happen to get COVID and you're unlucky enough to get it for whatever reason, it could be treatable in hospital with these various approaches. And these are great results to have because, again, the fear begins to go away from this disease. This graph really, I know it's complex, but captures the whole thing. Vaccination is by far and away the best way to do it because that's prevention is always better than cure. If the disease progresses, you get systemic disease, hospitalization, and then, as you all know, in the older cohort, severe disease and death, and in the medically vulnerable. Being obese is as risky as being in your 70s when it comes to this disease. But if you give vaccines, you stop everything. That's the dotted line there. If you give antivirals, anti-inflammatories, JAK inhibitors, IL-6, all that stuff, you suppress the inflammation and you stop the hospitalization and death using these approaches. So all this fantastic science has happened now in the last, 12 to 16 months to allow us to be, configure this scenario here, which is tremendous, really, in so many ways. So finally, then, let's think about the future. And I'm happy to take any questions you might have. If you have any questions. So here's the way we're going. Immunity is building up in the population, tremendous. That would have happened naturally in medieval times with lots of death. And the ones who survive are now immune. Luckily, we have vaccines. We invent medicines to help people, And we're going to see this build up. Vaccination is the safest way to do it, of course, but natural immunity is happening as well. Just people getting infected. So as the immune system is supposed to be like. So it's a great combination. So it's tremendous. So we are seeing immunity building up. This is why there isn't an upsurge in London. I reckon 95% of people in London are now seropositive for antibodies. So great, you need to see that level of immunity in the population. Therapies improving. Of course, there's issues around access and cost and all those usual worries we have with every situation in terms of treatments. But still, we have the therapies. Essentially, get the vaccine to all countries. Vaccine equity has to be uppermost in our minds. First of all, for ethical reasons, but to stop variants emerging. Boosters will be needed, as I just said, in the older population, those who are vulnerable. That's happening as well, which is great. And then finally, we will exit the pandemic when 80% of the world's population has either been infected or is fully vaccinated, or a combination of both, and we're heading in that direction. We're going to exit locally because obviously they get to 80%, and when we're at 90% of adult population, as you know, that means we're getting out of it. It becomes endemic, which means it will crop up now and again. The bottom line is going to be this. When anybody studies this in college, future nursing students or medical students or whatever, there will be a chapter called infectious diseases. I'm sure you've all done them. And this will be a little section called COVID-19. It will say this is a preventable disease through vaccination, and there's also therapies available in hospital, and here they are, and then you move on to the next chapter. So that's the future. That's the way we're headed with this in the end. We're not there yet. The unknowns that remain are new variants cropping up. A second unknown at the moment for us in Ireland is the schools. So we're still concerned about a surge there. That's looking good at the moment. Let's hope that's the case. But they're the main things we need to think about. And once we get the boosters out, like the flu, that will reassure us even more as we move towards Christmas. So they're the scenarios as I see as we move forward. And I'm very happy to finish there, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Hello, Professor O'Neill. Thank you very much for that. And I think you covered everything there with us there. Now, I just have a few questions here. Just wondering, after one gets COVID, how long does it remain in the system, and how long are you potentially infectious to others? Yes,
that's the quick question, Joe. We've had that for, since it started in many ways. On average, it lasts about, say, 12 days. It's like, with Delta, it's more quick actually. You begin to get symptoms within 3 or 4 days with Delta, whereas with the old-fashioned one, it was about 7 days before symptoms really began, you know. And then you might have symptoms for 3 or 4 days, then your immune system kicks in and you clear it, you know. So the vast majority of people will have an effective immune response to it, you see. And so you'll be infectious around that period, really. 2 weeks out, you stop being infectious. And that, as you remember, that was always the guidelines to stay home for that period, you know. There will be some people, like it's like everything in biology, there'll be a range, you know. Some will clear it more quickly, some it might take a bit longer, you know. It might go out beyond the 2 weeks, you see. And there are some people you can detect virus for weeks and weeks after, you know. We think they're remnants, though. You're not necessarily infectious at that time frame, you know. But on average, it's about a 1 to 2 week course, really, you know.
Great. Now I have another one here. Why do you think it's mainly the young people who died in the Spanish flu in the last wave?
We know that.
Was it because the older were? Was it because the older, more vulnerable, got the original strains, developed some immunity, therefore were more deadly? Therefore, it was more deadly for the young.
Great, that's a superb question, and people have worked on that. They've even exhumed samples from the Arctic and taken virus from them. Can you believe it? And looked in the lab. That flu virus was a very potent driver of the inflammatory response, much more potent than SARS-CoV-2. And younger people have a much more robust immune system, and that killed them in the end. Is amazing. But they massively reacted to it. Younger people, older people have a dampened inflammatory process, immune response as we get older. You know, that was an advantage with this one. So that's why older people didn't die. They didn't have such a rigorous response. You know. Secondly, we think that they did have protection from previous flus. Older people. It was cross protection, we call this, by the way. So if you had another flu strain, say you were infected in 1910 or something like that, you know, with the previous flu, that gave those older people a bit of protection, we think. So they're the two main reasons.
Okay, well, that's all I have there. So you're let off the hook now, and thank you so much for all of that. Okay.
Great. No problem. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
For the invitation.